Ever heard of a company so powerful that even their critics were kind of afraid to speak out against it?
I mean, a few come to mind.
Well, yeah, of course.
Mm.
But the one we're diving into today is MBIA. They were like this Wall Street darling, right?
Yeah.
And then practically overnight, they became a cautionary tale.
Wow. Overnight.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not literally overnight, but their fall from grace was pretty dramatic.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did they do?
Well, that's what we're going to unpack today. And we're using Christine S. Richards' book, Confidence Game, as our guide.
Sounds juicy.
It is. It's like a financial thriller,
Oh, cool.
complete with a skeptical hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman, who basically called Wall Street's bluff.
All right, so set the stage for us. What was MBIA's business? What made them so powerful in the first place?
So they started with what seemed like a rock-solid business model, insuring municipal bonds.
Municipal bonds, so like loans to cities and states.
Exactly. And historically, these bonds rarely default.
Okay, yeah, so that sounds like a pretty safe bet.
Yeah, it's like the financial equivalent of offering insurance on the sun coming up tomorrow.
I see. So low risk, probably steady profits.
Right. But here's where things get interesting. Fueled by their early success, MBIA strayed from their safe bet strategy.
Oh, so they got a little too confident.
You could say that.
Hmm.
They decided to venture into the world of these complex financial products, specifically CDOs,
CDOs. Now those are
collateralized debt obligations.
right, right. Those bundles of loans, right?
Yeah, imagine taking a bunch of different loans, like mortgages, student loans, credit card debt, throwing them all into a blender.
Hmm. Sounds messy.
That's basically what a CDO is, this jumbled mix of debt that's sliced up and sold to investors.
Okay, but the problem with those is, isn't it, that it's really hard to tell what's actually inside them.
Exactly. It's tough to assess how risky they really are.
Gotcha. So MBIA went from insuring something super safe municipal bonds to dealing with these financial mystery doxes.
Right. And they were assuring investors these CDOs were just as safe as their municipal bond guarantees.
Wow. Bold move.
Yeah, incredibly bold. And to put this in perspective, Richard quotes MBIA in her book.
Oh, okay. What did they say?
They told investors that their CDOs were structured to withstand massive defaults.
Really? What kind of language did they use?
Hold on, let me find the exact quote. Here it is. NBIA has structured its synthetic CDO transactions to withstand a very large number of investment-grade corporate defaults, typically about 7 times the average historical default rates.
7 times.
Yeah, and get this. And more than 2.5 times the historical maximum default rates before losing a single dollar.
Wow, that's some serious confidence.
Right, but it gets even better.
Better or worse?
Well, they go on to say that, in the company's opinion, this level of defaults would be an extremely unlikely catastrophic event approaching a global meltdown of corporate credit.
Oh, boy. That's a lot of faith in their models, isn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of faith in the stability of the financial system. Talk about ironies, right?
Especially considering what happened just a few years later.
Exactly. Now, this is where Bill Ackman comes in. He's the hedge fund manager who saw through all of this.
Okay, he's the skeptic.
Yeah. Ackman looked at MBIA and thought, this is a company built on faith. It only works as long as everyone believes they can back up their promises.
And he didn't buy it.
Not for a second.
So what did he do? Did he just, like, shout it from the rooftops?
Well, not exactly, but he was very vocal in his skepticism. He started digging deep into MBIA's financials. He questioned their accounting practices, especially their use of reinsurance transactions.
Reinsurance. That's like insurance for insurance companies, right?
Right. Ackman suspected that MBIA was using reinsurance to hide potential losses.
Trying to make things look rosier than they really were.
Yeah, exactly. Ackman even met with MBIA executives to voice his concerns. He had real data to back up his claims.
What did MBIA say?
They basically brushed him off. They had this stellar reputation, a AAA credit rating, and really close ties to regulators.
Oh, so there's the too big to fail element starting to creep in.
Right. And this is where we get into the concept of regulatory capture.
Okay, that sounds ominous. What is that?
Well, it's basically when a regulatory agency, which is supposed to be impartial, becomes too cozy with the industry it's supposed to regulate.
Ah, so like a referee who becomes best friends with one of the teams.
Exactly.
So are you suggesting that MBIA had the regulators in their pocket?
I'm not saying that directly, but it's something to consider.
Right, because if the regulators are looking the other way...
Then companies can get away with things they shouldn't.
Right, right. And nobody's really asking the tough questions.
Exactly. And this is what Ackman was up against.
So he's this lone wolf investor sounding the alarm while everyone else is enjoying the party.
Pretty much. But he wasn't going to let it go. He was convinced that MBIA was a house of cards waiting to collapse.
So what did he do about it?
Well, that's a story for part 2. Buckle up, because it's about to get wild.
Uh,
Welcome back to our deep dive into MBIA. Last time we left off with Bill Ackman, right?
yeah, he was waving that red flag pretty hard, trying to warn everyone.
Yeah, convinced that MBIA wasn't as invincible as they seemed.
And nobody was listening.
Nope. Pretty much everyone thought he was crazy.
So what happened? Did things start to unravel for MBIA?
Oh, yeah. Big time. And remember those CDOs, those bundles of debt we talked
That's
about?
there's financial mystery boxes.
Right. Well, they become the ticking time bomb at the heart of the financial crisis.
So it's 2008 we're talking about.
Yep, 2008, the housing bubble bursts and all those subprime mortgages start to default.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. And those CDOs that MBIA had been insuring, they start to implode.
And MBI had guaranteed those CDOs, right? Just like their municipal bonds.
Yep. They said they were structured to withstand massive defaults. Remember that quote?
So think about a global meltdown.
An extremely unlikely catastrophic event.
Yeah, that's the one. Famous last words, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So now, the very institutions that gave MBIA their AAA credit rating, they start downgrading them.
Oh, wow. So the market's starting to lose faith.
Big time.
Yeah.
And as MBIA's rating falls, the value of the bonds they insured, that plummets too.
So it's like this downward spiral.
A full-blown financial panic. All those unlikely events that MBIA had dismissed.
They're suddenly happening.
Yep. And Ackman's sitting there probably thinking, I told you so.
So what did MBIA do? Did they finally admit they were in trouble?
Well, at first they tried to downplay everything.
Really?
Yeah, they argued that they hadn't insured many residential mortgage-backed securities directly.
But they had all that exposure through those CDOs.
Right. But they tried to sweep that under the rug.
That's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Perfect analogy. They were in denial, still clinging to this belief that they were too big to fail.
But the market didn't buy it.
Nope, not for a second. The cost of insuring MBIA's debt, it skyrocketed.
Investors were heading for the exits.
Fast. And you gotta remember, this was a company built on confidence. When that confidence evaporated,
It was all over.
so any attempts to rescue MBIA?
A few. In December 2007, Warburg Pincus invested $1 billion in MBIA.
$1 billion. That's gotta be a lot, even for Wall Street.
It was a big chunk of change, but
It didn't work.
not really. A drop in the bucket compared to the losses MBIA was facing.
And plus the trust was gone, right?
Yeah. Investors were realizing that this risk-free guarantee, it was all an illusion.
Speaking of risk, you mentioned moral hazard before. How did that play into all of this?
Oh, moral hazard is a huge part of this story. It basically means that when someone's protected from the consequences of their actions,
They're more likely to take bigger risks.
exactly, because they think they'll be bailed out.
So MBIA thought they were too big to fail.
And their clients probably thought the same thing. So everyone was comfortable taking on more risk than they should have.
A recipe for a disaster.
Now, while all of this is happening, Ackman's watching it all unfold.
He must have been feeling pretty vindicated.
Yeah, but he wasn't done yet. Remember, he was just focused on MBIA. He was looking at the whole bond insurance industry.
So what's his next move?
He sets his sights on Ambac Financial Group. They were the second largest bond insurer,
Even bigger than MBIA?
and they had even more exposure to the mortgage market.
Oh, boy.
Ackman sends an email to his team, and he says, I think we should short some Ambac.
He's doubling down.
Absolutely. Remember that open source model he and his team developed?
Yeah, the one for analyzing those CDO portfolios.
Well, in January of 2008, it predicts huge losses for MBIA and Ambac.
Much bigger than what the companies were admitting publicly.
Way bigger. Ackman had basically cracked the code,
He was seeing the real risks.
and you know what he does? He makes the model public.
Wow. Bold move.
He was basically saying, here's the truth, folks. You can ignore it, but it's not going away.
But even with all this new information, MBIA still insisted they were fine, right?
They did. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Eric Dinalo, the New York State Insurance Superintendent, he was trying to coordinate a rescue plan.
Sounds stressful.
It was. He was basically trying to herd a bunch of panicked cats.
Everyone knew that if MBIA collapsed.
It could trigger a total financial meltdown.
So what happened? Did they manage to save MBIA? So last time we left things pretty much hanging in the balance.
That was a nail-biter. Would MBIA go under? Would the whole system crash?
A lot was riding on that. It wasn't just about MBIA. Remember their role in insuring those municipal bonds?
Right, if MBIA went down, It could have had a ripple effect on cities and states all over.
They wouldn't be able to borrow money as easily, right?
Exactly, and that would mean cuts to essential services, schools, hospitals, you name it.
So did the government step in, like a big bailout?
Not exactly a bailout, but Eric Dinalo, the New York State insurance superintendent, he knew he had to do something.
What did he do?
He got creative. He basically brought all the major banks to the table. A lot of them were tied to MBIA through those credit default swaps.
Oh, right, those swaps. So everyone had skin in the game.
Yeah, and Dinalo, he basically forced them to find a solution.
Kind of a high-stakes poker game, using the whole municipal bond market as leverage.
You got it. He knew that if MBIA went under, the insurance department could halt payments on all those guarantees, and that would have been a disaster.
So everyone had to cooperate.
It was the only way out. So they came up with this plan, a mix of capital infusions, restructuring, and probably a whole lot of yelling behind closed doors.
And did it work? Did they save MBIA?
They managed to keep them from going completely bankrupt. They split the company, separating the municipal bond business from that riskier structured finance stuff.
So MBIA survived, but not really in the same way?
Yeah, a shell of its former self, really. Reputation tarnished, stock price plummeting. They basically had to start from scratch.
A classic rise and fall story, huh?
And a reminder that no company, no matter how big, is truly too big to fail.
So what about Ackman? Remember, he was the one who saw all this coming. Did he come out of all this? Okay.
Well, he was definitely vindicated, right?
I mean, everything he predicted pretty much came true.
Exactly, but it wasn't all smooth sailing for him. Remember that investigation by Elliot Spitzer's office?
The one questioning his motives for shorting MBIA.
Yeah, that one. It took years for that to be resolved. But right as the financial crisis was reaching its peak, December 2007,
Oh, wow. So right in the thick of it.
the SEC finally cleared Ackman. They officially closed the investigation, said he'd done nothing wrong.
Talk about a vindication.
Right. But it shows how hard it can be to speak truth to power, even when you're right.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into MBIA, what are the big takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest one is don't be afraid to question things. Do your research, especially when it comes to your finances.
Don't just take someone's word for it, even if they seem like an expert.
Exactly. And if something sounds too good to be true.
It probably is.
Another thing to keep in mind is that complexity can often hide risk.
The more complicated something seems, the more wary you should be.
Exactly. And finally, remember that too big to fail is a myth.
No company is invincible.
Right. The MBIA story proves that pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
Financial crises are going to happen. They're part of the cycle. But by understanding what causes them, like a lack of transparency, those cozy relationships between companies and regulators, that moral hazard.
We can be better prepared next time.
Absolutely.
So that's our deep dive into the wild world of MBIA. What a story, huh?
Full of twists and turns.
And some valuable lessons, hopefully. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay curious.